just to give a little overview over who Andy is, our presenter. So Andy is a human performance specialist, a visiting professor at Manchester Metropolitan University, the Department of Psychology, and is a director of DNA Definitive. With an exclusive international portfolio of clients, he is in demand to help develop high-performance environments and to support elite teams, which he does through applied performance psychology and the development of evidence-based resilience-focused strategies. His work has taken him to and tested him in many different industries and countries around the world. He works with political leaders, high net worth individuals and corporate business leaders with a world-leading athletics and coaches, Olympic and Commonwealth and World Championship levels across the emergency services, with the British Armed Forces and with not-for-profit and third sector organisations. Andy is an Fellow of the Royal Society of Medicine, a member of the British Neuroscience Association, and a member of the British Sleep Society. He is a performance coach with the British Association for Performing Arts Medicine and associate with Bereave, a leading mental health and wellbeing provider. He delivers on international executive MBA programs at a number of universities in England, Wales and France. So thank you, Andy, for running this webinar for us, and over to you.
Thank you, it's my pleasure. I'll just see if I can effectively screen share. I presume is here and everyone can see the screen. So thanks very much for the introduction, and particularly for you for taking time out at the start of a week to join us. Normally, if I'm delivering a workshop or a course, the introductory activity is to see what people want out of the session. So clearly we can't do that. So I presume what was put out that we will cover over the next 45 or 50 minutes or so, it will be of interest. So as you heard in the introduction, I do work across different sectors, and I want to try and bring it to life a little bit, protecting client confidentiality where there needs to be some. And this applied work is supported by decades of research, not by me, but from the wider sort of academic community. So we're talking about performing under pressure. A lot of the work that we do is across the emergency services, where there's a need for people to function at the extremes of emotion in terms of how they make decisions, how they recover from decisions that they've made, how they transition from work to home. So these are some of the things that we might bring out this morning. Similarly, in the corporate world, some of these sort of ethical dilemmas and decisions and a sense of purpose can affect how we perform under pressure. So I'll try and bring an element of that. And there is nothing better really as a performance laboratory to look at what people from elite sport do. Whether we think it's of real importance or not, the sports science that underpins how people perform under pressure in a sporting environment are things we can take elsewhere. So I'm on my third Olympic cycle supporting various projects within the Team GB portfolio. The middle of the screen there, I do work with people who function in extreme environments. This is the Fortitude 4, a team of 4 that we supported who did the Talisker Whiskey Atlantic Row Race from December 2019 till January 2020. I'm delighted to say they won it, and they won it well. And they performed by working for 2 hours on and resting for 2 hours on that 4-hour cycle for 32 and a half days. So there are issues to do with living in a confined environment, issues to do with managing each other's sort of fatigue and personality, issues to do with recovery, navigating, making decisions. So that sort of stuff may come into it as well. And also we've been involved in supporting people with polar expeditions, either as part of a team or solo expeditions. So a little bit of a context. Through an academic role that was mentioned at Manchester Met, I have a duty of care really when I'm sharing information, or even in an informal sort of way like this morning, to make sure that it's as accurate and valid as possible. So I'll try and do that. So this morning, what we decided that we would talk about was the nature of stress and stressors, stress regulation in performance situations, self-care for sustained performance, and the need to harness social support. So I'll try and go through these 4 points. I thought you might also be interested in some work that I helped publish a year ago now with Professor Mark Jones, Professor Sir Carrie Cooper, and a couple of others. We were commissioned by Nuffield Health to look at the effects of remote working on health and well-being. Now that seems a bit like a Nostradamus moment now, 10 months later on. So that research has generated a little bit of interest, as you can imagine, over the last 3 months. So I'll try and weave that in as we go as well. That may be of some relevance. So starting with the nature of stress and stresses, without it being a sort of a psychology lecture, we do know that stresses can be events, they can be experiences, they can be environmental stimuli that result in a feeling of stress. So stressors and what we feel are very different things. Stresses are considered as physical or psychological or interpersonal stresses. So physically, it could be in any work environment. It could be a sense of isolation. It could be the restricted space we might have to work in. It could be a lack of privacy. It could be a reliance on life support systems if you are in an emergency services type setting. Psychological could be to do with high workload, periods of monotony, and then high intensity activity. It could be to do with shift patterns affecting our sleep. It could be to do with the stress and the strains. I'm a small business owner that perhaps we've felt over the last 3 months, that sense of uncertainty. Interpersonally, it could be if we're working across different cultures, could be tension with other people in the team, it could be worries about family and friends. All these things are stressors. How we experience and process those then causes a stress. So stress is the way that the body processes these demands. And essentially we've got 2 systems. We've got the sympathetic nervous system, which essentially speeds things up. When we feel and perceive the stress, our body reacts by becoming less sort of rigid, but things operate faster. Breathing rate, heart rate, and so on. And then when that perception of stress has passed, we should ease into this parasympathetic, the parallel nervous system, the one that helps us rest and recover. And you've seen on the diagram on the left-hand side, under sympathetic, there's a sort of a red bar as if it's from a graph. Under parasympathetic, there's a green bar as if it's on a graph. Now, we can measure this stuff, and we do it across sectors. So I'm going to share some of that research with you as well. So stress itself is neither good nor bad. A stress response where the heart rate and the breathing rate speeds up could be the ideal way of preparing for a sales pitch or an Olympic final or something in between. So we can measure this stuff, which we'll get into. What we know is that no one gets more intelligent under stress, but some of us get more stupid quicker than others, because this physiological response sort of does affect the way that our brain works. So I want to share with you what we teach people in sort of the A&E department or in the emergency services when they're in a sort of a critical moment to try and stop this move towards the wrong decision making. We also know from a perspective of looking at stressors that individual stressors, for example, fatigue or sleep disruption, can be important, but the main issue seems to be when they're clustered together. They seem to get amplified. So we're always in performance environments trying to reduce the cluster of stresses. As human beings, we're all pretty resilient, actually, and we can cope with individual stresses. If we look at sleep disruption there, as I said, the Fortitude 4, the guys who rode the Atlantic in the race were working on 2 hours on, 2 hours off for 32 days, 32 and a half days. They adapted to that sleep pattern very quickly. But you put the sleep pattern on top of fatigue, on top of actually a sense of being isolated, a sense of a little bit of tension with another team member, and all of a sudden those stresses become problematic. Clearly in a different way, the UN states that cluster of stresses are almost what determines whether something is deemed as torturous or not. And we do know that psychological stress and physiological stress share the same neural pathways. We can actually feel physical pain as a result of social isolation. Now, this is quite an interesting thing if we're talking about how people work effectively remotely, or how they work in a sort of a corporate business environment as well. So I said we can measure this. And what we can do is give people, with one of the large banks in the UK, we're involved in supporting their leadership team through one of the biggest banking transformations ever seen in banking. And we've had people wearing these monitors. It's a simple, non-invasive monitor that measures something called heart rate variability. So we're not taking blood tests in this environment. We're looking at how does the heart respond to stress and recovery. And we measure that by the pause in heartbeat. It's not whether someone's got a resting heart rate of 60 and then it may goes up to 90 under pressure. It's more subtle than that. We're measuring the pause between each heartbeat, which is measured in milliseconds. This gives us an opportunity to look at the physiology that causes that pause. Some of the stress hormones that you will have all heard of, like adrenaline and cortisol and things like that. And we can put that information on a graph. So the next slide I'm going to show you is a graph of an individual, and you'll see their stress and recovery through a day. So it'll start at about 7 in the morning on the left-hand side of the screen, and it'll take us through the day till about 7 the following morning. Now, this is a really good graph of someone who is managing their stress and their recovery well. So the stress response is measured and interpreted in red on the graph. And that's any of these stimulus that we've just talked about. The recovery response, the parasympathetic nervous system, is measured in green. And physical activity, which is where this could improve to some degree, is measured in blue. The darker the blue line, the more intense the physical activity. So a light blue line could be something like walking the dog. A darker blue line could be a fast-paced walk somewhere. So what you can see from this individual is they have managed this particular day, and I do know this was a particularly stressful period of time for the workplace, but they were able to manage their day well and bring in periods of active rest and recovery. The sort of the height of the colors on the graph, the red, the green and the blue, show the depth of that response. So straight away you can see at 1900 hours, about 7 o'clock in the evening, that was one of the biggest stress responses for this individual in the day. Now, this happened to be nothing to do with work. This is to do with a young family and getting children ready for bed. But you can also see that this individual, from just before 2300 hours, just before 11 o'clock, went to sleep, and their quality of sleep was really good. There's a whole block of green there for 7 or 8 hours. And we can determine that this individual would have slept for around about 8 hours, and the quality of their recovery mentally and physically while they were sleeping was over 7 hours. Sometimes we see people who are asleep for 8 hours, but their quality of recovery is about half an hour because of the stress that has built up in the previous days or weeks. So we can use some of this stuff quite effectively. But as I said, not only in extreme environments, we can use it in the corporate business workplace as well. And there's some fascinating research published by Harvard Business Review a few years ago that looked at extreme jobs And these are not athletes, they're not emergency services people, they're not military people, these are people in the business world. So they had a good group, they looked at almost 2,000 individuals, and they were able to determine that stresses are more likely to emanate from the organization, the structure, the patterns of communication, the leadership style, than their job itself. So the dangerous, stressful nature of the job, from a stressor point of view, plays second fiddle to the organizational structure and hierarchy and communication. So let me show you what they discovered. And they discovered that there are 10 factors that can make a business world type job extreme. If you can tick 5 or more of these 10 factors, your job could be classed as extreme because of the cluster of stresses it's likely to give you over time. And when I show this and see people's faces in the workshop, most people, as they look at it, say, actually, do you know what? I can add another 2 or 3 of those things. So the point of describing this is when we're talking about stress and stresses, we're not just talking about things like going into a burning building or attending an RTA or having to respond to people in an A&E department or to line up to face the All Blacks in Eden Park. We're looking at a cluster of these things. And as I said, most people will add 1 or 2 of these things. So this tells us we have to create, to perform under pressure, more opportunities for recovery. And we'll get into that a little bit as well. So I'll show you another 2 graphs of heart rate variability. These are people in the same environment as the last graph you saw, but this is their monitoring through the day from 7 in the morning till about 7 the following morning. Not only is there no green while they're awake, even while they're asleep, the body is under stress. They haven't mentally got strategies to switch off and recover. Not only is there no light dark blue, there's no light blue. There's no physical movement built into the day. And what we find is the more people feel under pressure, the more typical this becomes. They don't feel they can create an opportunity to rest and recover. They try and squeeze more into the day and less time to sleep and recover. And we know there is a neurobiology of elite people that means they spend more time recovering than others. So to set the scene, stressors are things that affect us. They're generally described as physical, psychological, or interpersonal. And stress is the response to those stresses within us. The more these things are clustered together, the more we see graphs like this. Now, typically, if an individual's graph is like this week after week, month after month, year after year, there's a buildup of what the GP would call allostatic load. There's a buildup of just hormonal stress in the body, too much adrenaline, too much cortisol. And over time, this is the thing that can lead to, the syndrome of burnout, which can affect us all, irrespective of intelligence, ethnicity, job description, wealth, and so on. We've done some published work with Wellbeing at the Bar, which is a not-for-profit that's looking into the health and well-being of barristers across the UK. And they find, 1 in 3 are living with a high degree of anxiety. 1 in 5 are considering leaving the profession. And we can read that about GPs. We can read it about so many people. And a lot of that is because of this, they're living with this physiology for such a long period of time. So what makes a pressure situation? Well, the volume of information that we may take in, there may be too much information, too little information, contradictory information. Well, I'm sure you can apply this to your own workplaces. Uncertainty and stress, misinformation, dynamic, fluid scenarios, and an inability to make sense of what's going on. Multi-agency communication, different parts of a business or working with partner agencies with competing agendas, or a failure to share information properly. There can be the emotion then, dread, worry, fear, excitement. can be a sense of our confidence being challenged, our confidence in our abilities, or in a specific situation, our interpersonal confidence. And there can also be, I think, from experience, what causes a pressure situation is the legacy that we want to leave for all that are involved in what we're doing. The legacy we want to leave them, or the legacy we want to leave for ourselves. So I'm going to share what the academic and the practical research suggests is good practice for decision making in high pressure situations as well. Because what we need to do is perform with the pressure. We need to anticipate that we'll feel it. And so we want to move from feeling frazzled to maintaining a sense of flow. So in sports terms, you may hear athletes talking about, being in the zone. And there's some good research, around the way the brain operates when it is in the zone. But more often we see people sort of fluctuating, moving from overwhelmed to distressed and so on. So this occurs because of cognitive overload, the amount of information that we're taking in or that we don't necessarily understand the environment. It can be to do with what we call cognitive appraisal, how well we understand our emotions. Are we feeling challenged and excited by getting to an Olympic final? Or are we actually then suddenly feeling completely overwhelmed by the situation we found ourselves in? And the same thing applies in the workplace. And then we've got these actual stress responses, the things in the moment that cause this sympathetic nervous system to take charge. So when I'm working with groups, teams, and individuals, I'm trying to say and explain what the actions that we can do in advance are. And these are understanding the environment we're going to find ourselves in. It's understanding the emotions we're likely to feel. It's using something which comes from the world of sport and performance psychology, which is now used in sort of preoperative surgery as an example of imagery and mental rehearsal. But we also need to know our values, because under high pressure, the brain, different parts of the brain start working a slightly different way, and we can develop flexible ethics if we're not sure of what our values are in advance of being in that pressure situation. And then when we're in that situation, we need to have actions that we use in the moment. So what we would call stress relief valves, really, to just give us a little bit more thinking space. So we'll go through these in order fairly quickly, but we'll go through them in order. So cognitive overload. So in advance, we need to understand our environment. So when we're making high stakes decisions, whether it's to do with a rugby game or patient safety or navigating if we're on our own in the South Pole, or if we're involved in, sort of a humanitarian or conflict situation, we need to be aware that we might be in a situation that we've not dealt with before. We've got no previous sort of analogy to draw experience from. In the case of supporting NHS workers and social care workers over the last 3 months, there may be no doctrine, there's no policy there to cover the situation we now find ourselves in. One thing that is consistent across all organizations, all jobs, all aspects of life, if we're experiencing uncertainty, that raises our stress levels. So from an uncertainty, decision makers need to know, well, what's the consequences of A or B? And what if there's not a good decision? How do we rationalize what the least bad decision is that we make? And then accountability. Actually, well, I've made this decision. What's going to happen to me next? All these things can make some decision making in environments quite an extreme experience. So experiencing stress is normal in high stakes environments, or what we perceive as high stakes environments. This makes the decision harder. So for this cognitive appraisal, well, we need to understand our emotions, and basically we can talk about this as much as we like. Emotions are essentially us recognizing what physiology has already happened in the body. So mentally, we catch up with the sympathetic nervous system after about 0.2 of a second. So if we're feeling, and our emotion is one of anxiety, it's because we're now recognizing the stress hormones that are already circulating through the body. So we need to understand that we're always going to be playing catch up with physiology. So if we can be curious as to why we might be getting a dry mouth or increased heart rate or butterflies in the stomach, it becomes easier to manage. But our emotions are like attention magnets. If we don't understand them, they draw our attention to all this physiology, and we can become very self-aware and forget actually what we're, the context of what we're trying to do. Daniel Kahneman, a Nobel-winning physiologist, has written a couple of books, which have been international bestsellers, but really sums it up. He says, we think with our body. We experience things viscerally first, and then mentally we're playing catch up. And my colleague at Manchester Met, Professor Mark Jones, another Welshman, I'm delighted to say, is a world expert on the idea of us being in a challenged state or a threatened state. And that's really about how we talk to ourselves based on the physiology we've got. So you may have a boxer going into a boxing final, in a very intense, hostile environment in the Ukraine, and he's a British boxer. As he's entering the ring, he may be in a challenge state. He may actually be feeling the pressure, but is quite excited about the situation he's created for himself. Alternatively, another boxer, or even him on a different day, may be in a threatened state. So we're always trying to coach people to move themselves into a challenge state where the self-talk becomes easier and decision-making becomes a little better. So how do we do it? Well, we make choices based on emotions, and then we try and justify them afterwards. The suggestion is about 45% of all our behavior every day is done at this sort of unconscious level. And we know that in the business world, conflicts in teams is usually about the emotional state of people in the team at the time of the conflict. It's not about the subject matter of the disagreement. So there's increasing evidence, increasing good, robust academic evidence about teaching people a skill called mindfulness. And the benefit of mindfulness is the transition into a state of concentration. It's not about having to, have a daily meditative practice, not that there's anything wrong with this, of, 60 minutes a day, but it's learning what we feel, being able to focus, and then put our emotions on it as well. So this helps us avoid some thinking traps. And it sounds easy to be mindful about what we're doing, but unless we practice it, it can be quite unsettling. And one of the more quirky bits of research around this, was suggesting that 67% of men and 25% of women were asked to just sit quietly in a lab for between 6 to 60 minutes, and they were given a toy to play with, which they knew would give them an electric shock, were giving themselves electric shocks frequently rather than just sit there quietly thinking about whatever they were thinking about. So mindfulness is absolutely, a learned skill. Imagery is something that we would then teach in advance, and great gains have been made on this over the last sort of 30 years or so, since MRI scanners have been more accessible for research. As a friend of mine, Paul Bonham, Paul is a BA pilot by day job. He under normal circumstances, is flying us from London Heathrow to Chicago and the States on long haul flights. But he's also a Red Bull pilot. You may have seen this over the years, the Red Bull acrobatic air race championship. And he was 3-time world champion. And he said what got him after 5 or 6 attempts to go from silver to world champion was imagery. It was about rehearsing. It was about actually trying to rehearse the movements that he was going to make, the split decisions he was going to make in advance of the race, of learning the track. He'd only ever get a chance to race the track on race day. So this is grounded in neuroscience. And of course, we do this effectively with sports teams and athletes more and more. And as I said at the beginning, in terms of emergency surgery and anesthesia within A&E doctors and air ambulance teams, imagery is something that is increasingly taught. So it's grounded in neuroscience. It's primarily under our conscious control. If we can rehearse in advance, we're more likely to bring in those feelings, thoughts, behaviors, and the pressure situation that we practiced in advance. It's particularly good for skill transference and bringing things from training to the actual event and environment. So if we've done that, if we understand our emotions, if we've done some mental rehearsal, we also need to know in advance what our values are. There's a personal values assessment test, a free one, which is, takes about 10 minutes to do. It's called the Personal Values Assessment Test online. I quite like it for the information it can give someone, free as a self-reflective tool. So I spend a lot of time with the teams, groups, individuals I work with, talking about calibrating your value compass. And I put a thing up of a picture of Sam Warburton there. I was delighted to work with the Wales national rugby team for many years, and the likes of Sam. And following the first time he captained the British and Irish Lions to the winning series in Australia, he wrote in his book about the exercise we did on his leadership and values compass and how he found that really, really useful when in the intense environment as being a captain in a British Lions tour. So we talk through calibrating the values compass, and that's sort of essential, really. Pressure erodes our self-awareness, and it can cause people to have a flexible approach to the values that they thought was stuck in the ground. We've heard things of head teachers of primary schools actually losing their job because they manipulated some stats figures of 6-year-olds. They would have never thought they would behave like that when they got their job. We know of other unethical things in sports, in business, in medicine. So constantly talking about values is a crucial part of making decisions under pressure. Being aware of this bombardment of distractions that we might face during the working day. It's a real challenge for us, when we're at home working. And I use that term wisely. We're not working from home during lockdown, we're at home working, which is a completely different psychological take on it. Distractions might be to do with our pet coming in the room when we're in an important meeting, or the doorbell going, or having to homeschool and then worry about what our maybe elderly parents or relatives are going through. So coping with this bombardment of distractions is key. And again, mindfulness comes up as something that can certainly enhance this decision making. So what do we do then in terms of tips? Well, if we can in advance understand the environment, practice some mental rehearsal, and be clear of our values, we need to give those values a sense of order, because in the extreme environments, one of them might have to be crossed out because there is no good decision to be made. There's just a least bad decision. So understand the environment, what can and probably can't be controlled. Reduce uncertainty by focusing on communication. It's a great predictor of team effectiveness. Professor Sandy Pentland at MIT is a computer sort of researcher, and he got people wearing some stuff that looked at interactions with other people over a long period of time. They did it with global sort of networking, video calls and telephone calls, and he was able to determine that patterns of communication within a team are the best predictor of that team's success. So absolutely focusing on communication is important. And I would also then say, from what we know about the brain, if we can finish tasks, that's always a good thing to do. We're not designed to multitask. We're not really designed the way the brain works to leave tasks undone. So finishing tasks can free up some mental capacity that allows us to maintain our attention as well. So those are things to look at in advance. The pressure release valves then, again, this can come from a little bit of sport. breath-led strategies, the answer is literally under our nose. The way we breathe reflects how we see the world. And this is some of the things we're measuring with that heart rate variability stuff. So listing and prioritizing is key. Self-talk should always be task-relevant, instructional self-talk. And this is where then, in sort of emergency medicine, they've got the ABC acronym, or ANC acronym in aviation. So we know exactly what simple things we've got to remember when everything else is going on. Cognitive reframing, sort of what I call a micro circuit breaker. Doing something simple and familiar in the moment is a really useful strategy of just helping us reset. There can be, even at the side of a road, if an air ambulance team has come down and the head doctor needs to make a decision, he might take himself away 10 meters away on his own for a moment just to think before he goes back to that precious situation. Calling on support from an expert who isn't actually there in the moment is also obviously a very useful strategy. I said that psychologically we're playing catch up with the body, so nutrition and hydration are important because we need to stabilize our blood sugar level. And then we look at strategies to transition from work to home. So, I would encourage, if there was time, I'd encourage people to think of high pressure situations that they've had to deal with. How did their values help them at that time? How did their understanding of their environment help? Was there a particular pressure relief valve that they found effective? And what about this constant inner chatter, that either inner critic, sometimes we face imposter syndrome. How do we manage that? Well, to get into this right frame of mind, we then need to look at self-care, and really sort of quickly. Self-care for sustained performance, and the way I communicate it is an acronym, SELF, self, sleep, exercise, learning, food. It seems that we're all increasingly prepared to sacrifice our well-being for success. Even as I say there, an F1 car needs a pit stop. We need this rest recovery. We need those bars of green that were on that first graph I showed you. And we know that from research, people with a pet or plant generally will take more care of their pet or their plant than they will of themselves. So this is what we look at. Sleep. It's hugely underestimated in terms of its ability to help us make decisions under pressure, and to continue to do that week after week, month after month. Every cell in the body, every cognitive process benefits from sleep. In the business corporate world, 68% of leaders say they get 5 to 7 hours per night of sleep. Looking at the population in the world as a whole and as an average, 7.5 to 8 hours as a healthy adult is what's recommended. Now, there are exceptions, and we deliver full day courses on science of sleep, so I won't get into that now. But the majority of C-suite executives get 7 to 8 hours per night. The majority of senior leaders in all the organizations I work with, we work with them to improve their quality of sleep. Exercise, well, in an evolutionary perspective, sedentary behavior is abnormal. Exercise makes our body work better and our mental processes work better. We can solve decisions faster standing up than we can sitting down, for example. So minimal daily exercise affects us with all systems. So there's a great book by Professor Shane O'Mara, a neuroscientist in Dublin. I think it's called In Praise of Walking, but we're not trying to encourage people to necessarily join a gym, but we're looking at posture, standing, moving for health and well-being. If you can do it outdoors, get that sort of what people call vitamin N, vitamin nature, that has a physiological effect as well. Learning, anything we can do to maintain our learning outside of the workplace, outside of the job, is really good right up until death, really. It doesn't have to mean formal qualifications, but challenging our brain to learn new things keeps it sort of plastic, what people call a sense of neuroplasticity, and that then allows us to amend and adapt when we need to. And then food, basically, diet is destiny. How we're eating over our lives, has an effect long term. a lot of the feel-good chemicals in the body, things like serotonin, are actually found in the gut, and then they spread through the body. So there's bits of advice there, and we could talk about how to manage caffeine and the type of food, I guess, at another time. So social support. This is one of the most crucial elements, I think. Resilience and performance is essentially a team sport. Scott Kelly, some of my colleagues monitored people on the International Space Station and sort of preparing for space flight. Scott Kelly and Mikhail Kononenko were together on the International Space Station for several months. Professor Gros Sandal, who was interviewing them when they came back, about how they coped, said to Mikhail Kononenko, she had a huge battery of questions to ask, what got you through this last period of time? And he just said, Scott Kelly. The benefit of that social support to harness their ability to cope under pressure, is evident for all to see. So professional isolation is negatively associated with performance. Role-related isolation, as we progress through the hierarchy of an organization, is something that men in particular underestimate the negative impacts of that role-related isolation. We know that it affects us, hormonally. Things like oxytocin can come when we're in a safe, psychologically safe, social supportive environment with a business mentor, for example, or another member of our leadership team. And that then has an effect of reducing the severity of the body stress response. That will help to create little blocks of green on the graph that I mentioned at the beginning, and all sorts of other things. So we underestimate the comfort of supervision, of mentoring a lot of the time. But reaching out for emotional support when we are at our most challenged is one of the most resilient things we can do. And in organizations where historically maybe there was a culture of bullying and harassment, I mentioned the legal profession. The Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh commissioned some research to try and stamp out bullying and harassment in the operating theatre. Reaching out for social support is now being seen as something that is culturally acceptable. It's not seen as a sign of weakness. And as I draw towards the end, I've mentioned the remote working. This is the paper. It's obviously a free download white paper we did for Nuffield Health. So there are a few of us contributed to it. The effects of remote working on stress, well-being, and productivity. About 12 months ago, but there's been interest in it of late. So, as a summary, one study, found that remote working has an effect on workplace well-being. Generally, though, remote working can be seen as, this was a year ago, seen as positive. But if we've got a sense of control over working at home, it can be seen as positive. Most of us had lost that control over the last 3 months, which is psychologically more challenging. There is no perfect ratio, according to the literature, of the amount of time if people are working from home to being in the workplace. It's clear that individual differences should be taken into account. So some people do not get on with home working at all, and they will have really perhaps struggled over this last 3 months. A lack of communication or organizational and leadership empathy, for want of a better expression, is a really good predictor of stress and burnout. If people are working from home, and I guess this lockdown period has made this happen, company practices should be open. And I hope for those where people have experienced sort of being furloughed, there has been that transparency as well. And then if people are working from home, well, social media platforms should be used effectively to try and create what are called the water fountain chat. Professor Sandy Pentland, who I mentioned, who predicted communication is one of the best predictors of teamwork, actually said communication outside of formal meetings is the best predictor of effective teams. So he was trying to get people to shorten the length of their formal meetings, but keep the same meeting length time so people could have these informal, high energy conversations around the agenda. So we still need to try and create that opportunity as well. So as I said, you're not working from home, you are at home working, and psychologically this is a very different way of approaching it. You know, our personal health, physical, mental and emotional, is more important than anything else at the moment, is what we're hearing. Well, you know, I'd certainly argue that that's always the case. When working at home, we shouldn't try and compensate for any lost productivity by working longer hours. We shouldn't compare with how we're coping with how we perceive others to be coping. And we need to recognize that our successes currently, and looking back, you know, shouldn't be measured in the same way as they were before. So as a last summary slide, in case there are questions, we said we'd go for about 45 minutes or so. Stress itself is not good or bad. It depends how we're approaching the situation. I've tried to demonstrate that a mix of both problem solving and emotional focused strategies can be helpful, particularly in what we perceive to be challenging environments. And I've just tried to illustrate that with things that I thought might bring the talk to life, with sort of polar explorers and rowing the Atlantic and A&E stuff. But whatever we perceive as a challenging environment, a mix of problem and emotion focused strategies can help. Breathing should be a go-to skill, and I would encourage people to be aware of what we call deep, deliberate breathing. Deep breathing is to bring our breath down to our diaphragm, so actually the top third of our lungs, just from under our chin to our sternum, and not moving at all. The deliberate nature is the number of breaths per minute, and a ratio for healthy adults with no sort of breathing difficulties of about 6 breaths per minute keeps us in what Professor Mark Jones says, that challenge state. If we're starting to increase our breathing rate, then the sympathetic nervous system is taking over and we're more likely to feel threatened by the situation we're in. So breathing is a go-to skill, may take it through to mindfulness practice, you know, along the spectrum if people are interested. Self-care is all about nurturing recovery, which is really, really hard to do, but it's sleep, exercise, learning, food. It's all about recovery. And we know that we are incredibly resilient organisms as human beings. Resilient people who perform well under pressure, do not avoid stress. They just understand it well. And they foster this positive adaptation to everyday stresses or the more traumatic experiences like the emergency services may have, or like trying to row the Atlantic. I'll pause there and happily, you know, engage with any questions if there are any. I'll stop the screen share for a moment if I can. I seem to have lost my cursor. Let me try a different way of doing it. Go.
Thanks, Andy. Don't know if anybody wants to come off the microphone and ask questions or make any comments. Feel free. I think it's all in your presentation, Andy.
Can I say, I think it's...
there we go.
Yes, Carmel here. I'd like to say I'm really enjoying this fantastic webinar. Thank you very much. I'd be very interested later on if you could make a comment on, you know, this is obviously about highly motivated people and people in you know, with a lot of autonomy and ability to make decisions, control all of that, even though, you know, we know that they can have we all have issues like that, but it's how one can bring that sort of culture further down into an organization, which is a big challenge, of course, in terms of getting, you know, staff on board and productivity in business. And so don't know if you've got any thoughts on that, because it is about people then performing under pressure, and all the things you talked about, emotions, etc., play a big part in that.
Thanks, Kamala. I'll try and answer it with what comes to mind immediately. And there's some interesting research around something called compassionate leadership, which
Okay.
I know the NHS have been, particularly in Wales, through Health Education Improvement Wales, have been encouraging the leaders of teams and departments to do over this most challenging of the last 3 months. But the elements around compassionate leadership are to try and start every single meeting by revisiting the values of the organization. And there's some good research that by doing that and by encouraging people from different levels of the organization to sit in leadership meetings and then disseminate the challenges that the leadership team are facing and going through has really good effects. General Stanley McChrystal, who led the the coalition troops in Iraq, wrote a book called Team of Teams. And I know a lot of businesses have actually got a lot from reading that book and employing some of the ways that he said he was trying to create a team of teams. And they would bring in people from all levels and all ranks to the top decision-making meetings to observe the dilemmas, the challenges, the processes that they went through. So those are two things, off the top of my head that, depending on the organization, you could begin to explore.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Anyone else? It was a very information-packed webinar this morning. Quite an interesting way to start the week off there. I think you're free for a coffee, Andy, this morning now.
Okay. Well, I would say, going back to the caffeine, part of the thing is the tired brain doesn't recognize in itself when it's getting tired and when it's sort of deteriorating in its decision making. So things like caffeine are used, and then of course that stops people sleeping and recovering because the half-life of caffeine is 8 to 10 hours, and then you're just on this sort of cycle of feeling tired and having caffeine as a tool. So I know you're flippantly saying it's time for coffee. When we're looking at people's energy times and decision making through a day, we would start to build up a sort of a profile of time and type of food, time and type of exercise, time and type of caffeine, time and type of deep work, all that sort of stuff. So the morning is the best time for caffeine, not after about 2 in the afternoon.
Well, about 10 o'clock at night then, not good.
No, well, unless you're doing shift work, in which case caffeine before a little nap, ironically, can help people through the shift.
Oh, I'm a caffeine addict. I'm not sure you'll ever get me off and not much exercise. So you've given me too much to think about this morning now. Thanks for that. Got a few comments. Thank you. Very helpful and much appreciated. Very enlightening, and you've already provided stimulus for me to reflect on my experience and planning or thinking about current challenges, which I do see mainly as challenges. So some nice little comments on the side there. I'm not sure if you can read those. Hannah's off to go and do some exercise.
Oh yes, I've just opened the chat. Okay, that's great. Thank you all very much.
Yeah, thanks Andy for taking your time out to present that. Thank you to everyone for coming along. Don't forget, if you're an AGP client, if you could look out for those AG3s for me to get them back, and the webinar feedbacks as well, that would be great. Apart from that, all have a good day. Enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Bye.